Bhutan, Yemen, Oman, UAE, Qatar, all these countries and states and places, they were a part of the Indian Empire.
After 1857, the British state decides it needs to rein in the East India Company, and it nationalizes the company. After World War I, the British decide that it needs to start having kind of like passports, okay? And so it creates the first Indian passport, which is called the Indian Empire passport.
Oh.
There's a passport of a Yemeni Jewish woman who's trying to migrate to Jerusalem. In order to migrate from Yemen to Jerusalem, she has to do so on an Indian passport because by virtue of living in Yemen, she is legally an Indian citizen. The British Indian Empire was about 2.5 times larger than the Republic of India is today. Burma was the largest and richest province of British India. Okay? So far larger and far richer than Bengal, Punjab, like Madras, Bombay, these other colonial provinces. What happens is that you have more people sailing to Rangoon for a better life than to New York.
After recording this episode, I realized that I knew nothing about India's partition. In this episode of Discovery of an Author, we sit down with author Sam Dalrymple to discuss his book, Shattered Lands, 5 Partitions and the Making of Modern India. And if you do decide to listen to this brilliant episode, then these are the learnings or these are the new information that you'll gain. You will get to know about the actual British India Empire, what all countries were a part of the Indian Empire. You'll get to know about the 5 partitions that led to making of modern India and Asia. You will also get to know that how countries like Dubai, Qatar, Bhutan, Nepal, Burma were once a part of the Indian Empire. You'll also get to know about the real role of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and also Japanese imperialism in the partition of India from the British. And lastly, you'll get to know some amazing and mind-blowing facts about 2 of the most popular leaders of the Indian freedom struggle, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi and Jinnah. Watch this episode till the end, and this will surely give you information that I am 100% sure you were not aware of. If you really like this episode, then I humbly request you to please subscribe to our channel, share this episode with the ones you feel would truly benefit. There's a new feature called Hype. If you hype our episode, it will reach to a wider audience. And if you don't like it, you don't have to subscribe. I truly hope that you enjoy this episode and this podcast with Sam Dalrymple. Thank you. Just 1 second. Okay, let me be very honest with you. I'm a 36-year-old man. I have been a very studious student when I was in schools and universities, and I used to love history. My grandfather was an historian in a way that he used to love history. His idol was Jawaharlal Nehru, and growing up, so was, I was in awe of that man. After reading your book, I realized I know nothing about my country. I mean, absolutely nothing. There were so many moments in a book when I read, I'm like, what the hell? Did this really happen? And I was like, how?
Thank you so much.
It's incredible.
That's very kind.
But it's a fact. And I was like, this should be a mandate reading for all the children, and CBSE should in one way or the other incorporate, because they do not. And I think clearly what they're trying to do is to pick up bits and pieces of what makes sense to them or the people who are behind creating the education institutes. I don't know. What's your take on it? Why don't we know about these things?
I think that every country in the world has this issue with mythologizing the kind of founders of the nation in some sense. So, you go to Pakistan and you get images of Jinnah that just would be alien to the man himself. I think likewise, everyone from Nehru, Gandhi, Savarkar, the whole lot have all been sort of lionized in such ways that sort of detract from their very humanness in some sense. And I think that Britain has, for example, the same issue with regards to Winston Churchill. They cannot fathom criticisms that make the man a kind of, a flawed and fascinating human being who is right on so many things, but kind of, also an utter racist, whose policies would lead to so many dead in India during World War II, particularly in the Bengal famine. And I think that, in much the same way, I think we grow up with very simplified narratives. I went to school in Delhi, and the moment that I began researching the Nehru, Gandhi, and Jinnah of the 1920s, as opposed to the 1940s, I was suddenly coming face to face with figures who I just did not recognize. In the 1920s, Jinnah is the great ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, whilst Gandhi is largely perceived as the kind of, communal guy invoking ideas of Bharat Mata and kind of, bringing Hinduism into politics. I think over the course of their careers, they kind of switch over so that by the 1940s, Gandhi is leading peace marches through Bengal and, really fasting and refusing to celebrate independence because of the deaths that have resulted. And yet Jinnah has become the kind of spokesperson for Pakistan and the establishment of a religion, of a state on the basis of religion. So I think that there's so many fascinating ways that these characters change over time that we are so deeply unfamiliar with.
But I also want to talk about, because growing up, my parents are from UP. I'm also from North India. My parents are from UP. They have seen Kanpur.
Lovely.
Kanpur. So they have seen the Sikh riots when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and they have seen what happened to the Sikhs. And my uncle, my mother's elder brother, he actually saved one of his Sikh friend when the attacks were happening. In UP, obviously, they have seen a lot of communal riots between Hindus and Muslims. And whatever I know of the history, we as Hindus, I don't know if we ever retaliated, or if we did retaliate, I know about that, I have no idea. That side of the thing has never been taught to us. Growing up, we were always taught that you have to be very careful of the Muslim community. And I wanted to sometimes understand that, because was the partition of Pakistan and India a reason for this narrative getting spread either by leaders, either by spiritual gurus, vice versa, on both the geographies? What's your take on this thing?
I think an extraordinary amount occurs in the course of the 1940s. And particularly, I think that there's several things. One is that in the 1930s, Congress will take over many of the provinces, and as will various other groups, political parties, and there's a lot of violence against Muslims, particularly against Muslim landlords. It's actually quite a lot of it initially seems to be much more to do with class, much more about anti-landowners, because a lot of UP's, aristocracy had been Muslim, which was the opposite in places like Bengal, for example, where it was a largely Muslim population with a majority Hindu aristocracy. And so these anti-aristocracy protests would very frequently in the course of the 1930s get wrapped up in religion. Now, what changed, of course, is in the 1940s, as the partition became more and more likely to happen, you get Direct Action Day in Kolkata, where Hindus and Muslims turn on each other in the streets. And I think what we forget is the extent to which paramilitary groups are the key thing. So of these paramilitary groups that emerge in the 1930s, today the RSS is still there, but we forget that there were like 50 of these. Right? There were the Muslim League National Guards, which was a kind of likewise, training up young Muslim cadres with sticks and learning martial arts and stuff. You had the Congress cadres, you had communist cadres, and there were several of these groups who went around defending neighborhoods. Now, these groups, after World War II, get access to huge numbers of weapons. And I think we forget the World War II aspect here. Suddenly, thousands of people have gone off to war learned to use weapons. And it's not surprising that the worst violence will happen in Punjab, which is where most of the army had come from, right? And so what you get is then, as the debates around Pakistan and partition emerge, partition violence emerges, but it's different than the normal communal violence that I think happened earlier and happens to this day, in that it's happening by people with machine guns. And this is something that I think we haven't fully reckoned with in India or Pakistan today, is the fact that so much of this violence occurs because of how heavily armed and how many guns are just floating around at the time. At the same time, you begin to get entire communities basically pushed out. So today, I think we forget how. I think that there is far too much focus on the partition as something that just affected Punjab and potentially Bengal too, as opposed to the biggest cataclysm that affected South Asia ever, that entirely reshaped its demographics entirely. So, Karachi was Hindu majority before partition and became Muslim majority. Delhi, Lucknow, Agra, and Jaunpur were all basically the main indeed Hyderabad, etc., were all the main bastions of Muslim learning, as they had been for about 400 years. You had whole swathes of modern-day UP that were basically Muslim majority, as you did Madhya Pradesh, as you did Gujarat. And one of the things that I think has really begun to change in a lot of partition studies at the moment is focusing away from Punjab and to look at its effect on places as a whole. For example, did you know that the state that was most demographically changed by partition was Tripura in northeast India, that was mostly Adivasi before partition and now is majority Bengali Hindu because of the number of Bengali Hindu refugees fleeing what became East Pakistan. Likewise, there were 3 times more refugees fleeing from Telangana, which was Hyderabad state, both Hindus fleeing Razakars, but also Muslims who then fled to Pakistan once India basically annexed Hyderabad state. 3 times more refugees than were produced in the Palestinian Nakba the same year. So, the migration that pushes Palestinians out of, Jaffa, etc., and leaves them on the Gaza Strip to this day, is that 3 times more refugees come from Telangana, and yet we say, oh, partition didn't affect South India, which is completely wrong. There's a really amazing archive in Berkeley at the moment in California called the Partition Archive. And they have just produced an amazing book called 1,000 Stories or something, about 1,000 voices, 1,000 stories, which are different oral histories of partition, each from a different community or a different village or a different town. And what's amazing is that they've included places that we've never heard of partition narratives. For example, how Orissa was reshaped by refugees arriving from what was then Bangladesh. How, Ladakh had never been, Muslim population had never been able to, Ladakh Wazarat, I think it was called, had been Muslim majority until it was cut off by the line of control from Gilgit and Baltistan. And then suddenly Buddhist culture has this big cultural resurgence. They look into how Bombay was reshaped, how Gujarat was reshaped, how Balochistan was reshaped, and how, one of the most important pilgrimages in Rajasthan until 1947 had been visiting Hinglaj Mata in Balochistan. And suddenly that was severed. Many Muslims of Karachi, meanwhile, were severed from visiting Nizamuddin Aulia, who is to this day revered as the most important Sufi site for most Muslims of Karachi, and yet they can never visit. So there's all of these complex changes that happen. We forget that partition was the largest forced migration in human history. No other migration comes close. There's 12 to 15 million people who were forced to migrate in the course of basically 9 months. It's extraordinary. And 1 to 3 million people never make it. Now, most of those deaths happen in Punjab, but I think not all of them do. And it also hugely affects Haryana, Himachal, Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, Tamil Nadu, Assam, all of these places have been shaped, and it's wrong for us to just associate it with Amritsar, Lahore.
Yeah, that's where we go wrong, right? That's when I said when I read a book, I was in complete awe and shock. I am so sorry for the sudden interruption. ये हमें करना पड़ता है और हमको इसी प्रकार से interrupt करना पड़ता है. But I have a request कि guys, अगर आपको थोड़ी भी value लग रही है in what we are providing with our podcast, in the kind of content that we are creating, and in the kind of people that we are bringing on our show, please subscribe to our channel. This is the only way in which any podcast on YouTube can grow. It will cost you nothing. आपने सिर्फ subscribe करना है, and trust me guys, if you subscribe to this podcast, we'll make sure that we continue delivering you such amazing content, intelligent content. हम एक intelligent podcast create करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. That is why हमारे जितने भी guests होते हैं, वो सारे published authors होते हैं, जिनका work के there's a backing to their work. कोई भी कुछ ऐसे नहीं बोल रहा. So guys, please subscribe to our channel and continue enjoying and listening to this episode. So, okay, I just want to show the people Shattered Lands. I have still a couple of chapters to read because the notes, it's incredible. It's just incredible. I want people to just close their eyes and buy the book. It is incredible. This is what you should have been taught in the history-wise going up in schools in India. I mean, this is brilliant. Now, what shocked me to my core after reading a book, you talk about the 5 partitions, okay, the 5 major partitions. I had no idea that Burma, Nepal, Bhutan, Yemen, Oman, UAE, Qatar, all these countries and states and places, they were a part of the Indian Empire. They were called the Indian Empire. And I have read somewhere that earlier in Dubai, their currency used to be rupiah or rubia or something like that. In the Indian rupees. It was the Indian rupees. And no one, I had no idea that Qatar, UAE, Yemen, Oman, they were the part of Indian Empire. That's crazy. And I always used to thought that Nepal was always an independent and an indigenous country, had no links. I recently came to know that Sikkim was not a part of India. And then it got reunited in India. And that is when I visited Sikkim. The locals told me over there, who were all majorly Buddhist, Sikkim recently got reacquired into India. I'm like, what the hell? I don't know.
1975.
Yes, 1975. I had no idea. So before we go into the partition, my fundamental question to you is this. We'll come to the partition, but I first want to understand the unification of all these countries under the Indian Empire. Sure. Why call it the Indian Empire if you had countries like UAE and Qatar, which were the Arabic ecosystem and the Persian Peninsula and everything? Why Indian Empire? They could have been the Arabic Empire, right? So first, let's clear this formula. How did all these things come under the umbrella of Indian Empire?
So what later becomes the Indian Empire is basically anywhere conquered by the East India Company, which is a commercial company. It's not the British state. It's like, I don't know, Elon Musk going around and conquering places. It's a corporation. After 1857, the British state decides it needs to rein in the East India Company, and it nationalizes the company. Okay. Now, in 1857, anywhere that had been conquered by the East India Company is handed over to a new state office. So Britain had 3 states of government, right? You had the Home Office, the Foreign Office, and the Colonial Office. But they decided to create an entire new one called the India Office because the East India Company's territories were so vast that they needed their own thing. It was a quarter of the world's population, stretching from what's now Yemen in Aden, all the way as far east to what's now Burma. At the time, in 1857, it also included, for about a year or two, it included places like Singapore as well, and parts of Malaysia. It also included randomly bits of Somalia even. But, when they are creating this India office, they're like, this is too big, so we're going to remove those bits, okay? So basically, from kind of 1860, India is this enormous swathe. Now, 1/3 of the Indian Empire was not directly ruled. They were anywhere that had treaties or protectorate treaties with Britain. So this was anywhere like Jaipur, Jodhpur, Hyderabad, Kashmir, with Maharajas, with sultans, with sheikhs. We forget that the status of Jaipur on Independence Day was not part of India. It was a kind of independent state, and it had to be integrated by Sardar Patel and VP Menon, hence why his statue is now the tallest statue in the world in Gujarat, right? There were 565 princely states that would later be integrated into India. But if you look at the British list of princely states as it was in the 1920s, it opens alphabetically with Abu Dhabi, goes on to list Bhutan, Nepal, Oman, etc. So these were princely states, just the same way. These were Maharajas, Sultans, Sheikhs. They were the same thing in the British imperial order. But some princely states got away. And that's, I think, the thing that we so often miss in Indian nationalist retellings of this story. When you hear about the Maharaja of Kashmir trying to remain independent, or the Nizam of Hyderabad trying to remain independent, we dismiss this as crazy guy doing crazy stuff, right? Forgetting that Nepal, Bhutan, Dubai, Qatar, Kuwait, etc. all did the same. And that there was no legal reason that these places had to be integrated into India. It's because the Indian government basically twists their wrists and forces them into the Indian Union. Sardar Patel and VP Menon, he's known as the Iron Man of India for this reason, right? This was not necessarily always willingly that these places were integrated into India. And you can go to many places and there's, with Hyderabad, the Indian army goes in. Kashmir is obviously India and Pakistan are fighting over it since independence. But it's incredible how much this happened. So anyway, after World War I, the British decide that it needs to start having kind of like passports, okay? And so it creates the first Indian passport, which is called the Indian Empire passport. And I actually found, and it's published in the book, there's a passport of a Yemeni Jewish woman who's trying to migrate to Jerusalem after the Balfour Declaration declares it a new homeland for the Jewish people, right? And in order to migrate from Yemen to Jerusalem, she has to do so on an Indian passport because by virtue of living in Yemen, she is legally an Indian citizen. And this is just something that we've completely forgotten. We've forgotten that British India was not the same as the Republic of India. We assume we conflate the two incorrectly. And in fact, the British Indian Empire was about 2.5 times larger than the Republic of India is today.
I think I saw that photo of that passport and I was like, this is absolutely mind-boggling. This is incredible. I mean, to even get your hands on the passport and to actually put that image, it was very, and I felt that, okay, now my next question, because of the, of the same lines, Sam, when I was reading a book, there was also talks about how Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, then he also started going to these places and countries. Was Gandhi seen as a leader in all these countries as well? So what I'm trying to ask is that did these places like Yemen, Qatar, Burma, Bhutan, Nepal, what was their inclination towards Indian? How did they saw India? Did they in their minds they were like, yes, if we do get independent, we would want to be a part of the ecosystem because we admire their leadership, because we admire MK Gandhi, because in Burma, you were mentioned about a leader, a Buddhist leader, who used to idolize Gandhi. So were there similar leaders in such countries who idolized Gandhi, who looked up to him that, yes, he is the man who is going to liberate us. He is the man who is going to fight our fight for us. So I want to understand. So I know the Indian mentality. I know the Indian sentiments, but I also want to understand the sentiments of these people, of these countries who were a part of the Indian Empire. What was their end game?
Sure. That's a brilliant question. And I think one that really hits at the core message of the book. When nationalists begin basically getting together in political parties in the 1880s to basically say that we want to get rid of the British and we want independence, we forget how we forget which questions they had to ask themselves, because these people, by and large, were not asking for the Mughal Empire to come back. They weren't asking for the Burmese Empire to come back. They weren't asking for the Maratha Empire to come back. They were asking for a new nation, right? And this was a nation that had never existed before, because if they had inherited the Raj from the British, had they kicked out the British, they would have inherited a colony that stretches from Yemen to Burma, right? You get the beginnings of an Indian nationalism that does stretch to places like Rangoon and Aden. I don't think it percolated that much outside of the big cities, and that's the important thing. So if you asked someone in Dubai what they felt, right, they would have probably said, I feel Khaliji and Arab, I don't feel Indian, right? But in Aden, in Yemen, we do have at least a couple examples of Arabs who begin to identify as Indian nationalists and congressmen. In Burma, the most popular politician is Mahatma Uttama, who's Gandhi's disciple, who is explicitly campaigning as kind of, the local Congress guy. And but I think that what begins to happen is that it becomes clear that there are several nationalisms. So, for example, some people in the Deccan in Hyderabad say, we actually want an independent Hyderabad state, and even Hindus go along with this idea, right? You have people in Nepal who say, we want a Nepali nation and no one else. You have several states in Rajasthan that propose an independent Rajasthan, right? That's not linked to India. And there are so many different ideas of nationhood. Some people say Dravidians or Tamils should have their own nation. Gandhi then pivots, and Gandhi begins pushing more and more for the boundaries of the future Indian nation to be that of Bharatvarsha. Bharatvarsha is this idea that's been there in the Indian subconsciousness since at least 1500 BC with the Mahabharata, okay? And it's the idea of this sacred land south of the Himalayas, north of the Indian Ocean, that's bounded by the mountains and, from Sindh to Assam and from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. And it's a one that we all, I think, know about. And he basically thinks that this is a really good way to unify as many people as he can. But it alienates the Burmese and the Arabs because, these places are not part of Bharatvarsha. Crucially, Bharatvarsha has never been a political entity ever before Gandhi. Okay, so although since the time of the Mahabharata, people have referred to this land as Bharatvarsha, it's more of an idea like Asia or Europe. There's never been a united Asia, even though we've referred to Asia for thousands of years. There have been several empires like Ashok, the Mughals, who have come close to unifying it, but they never actually managed the entire region. But Gandhi decides that this is going to be his platform. He's going to try and unify everyone within a Bharat. But this alienates people like Mahatma Uttama, who actively feels insulted by this. And as a result of increasingly basically Hindu nationalist visions of India's future becoming popular, the idea of a Bharati nationalism becomes very, very popular. But it's what also, I think, one of the reasons, and this is something that I don't think Hindu nationalists have contended with enough in this country, it's the reason why Dubai, Yemen, and Burma are all separated from India, because they limit their vision to essentially Bharat and don't allow for a world in which Arabs and Burmese could become Indians too. And interestingly, a lot of Arabs and Burmese nationalists were proposing that. They were proposing basically the unifying factor should be a shared history of colonialism. They should inherit the entire steel frame of the British Empire and not but just get rid of the British, basically remove the top layer, but keep everything else. But of course, that doesn't happen. And later, this kind of this undivided India is created as a result of separating the Gulf states, as a result of separating Burma. We, I think, all grew up in India with this idea of undivided India. Yeah. And actually, it was only unified as that shape for 5 months in 1947, after Dubai's separation and before Pakistan's separation. And that's, again, something that I think that we have this misinterpretation of undivided India was only created by explicitly dividing the Indian Empire.
I mean, what an irony, right? I mean, it is just, I don't know whether to laugh, whether to cry, whether to be in awe or I don't know. It's just what it is. Was Gandhi's idea of Bharatvarsha, Akhand Bharat, as we say, equivalent to a Hindu Rashtra? Was that in his mind, kya? Okay, in my head, Bharatvarsha is a Hindu Rashtra. Was that another variable in the equation that made it easier for him to chuck out these countries?
I don't think that was his idea. I think he saw this as a sacred geography. It's a Hindu geography, but it's a sacred geography, and we can accept everyone living within it. But definitely, people like Jinnah interpret this as communalism. Yeah. If that makes sense. So although that wasn't Gandhi's intention, one of the reasons for Jinnah, etc's growing alienation is this idea that, hey, you guys have just separated off all the non-Hindu bits, and suddenly India has gone from a very diverse place to a mostly Hindu place. And they began to feel more threatened. We've just removed the entire Gulf. Why did we have to do that?
Yeah. So whether losing all these parts as an Indian empire, as of India that we know today, is good or bad, or has turned out to be bad, we'll discuss that, because that is also a very interesting thing to understand, because now Qatar and all these countries are some of the richest countries in the world. And you have mentioned in the book that at that time, there was no discovery of oil, and all these sheikhs were not even given any hoot because nobody gave a damn to them. They were not even worth anything at all. Nobody used to be concerned with them.
They were the lowest ranking princes of the princely states. So Jaipur got 17 gun salutes, Hyderabad got 21 gun salutes, Dubai got 0.
Absolutely. And now
the only one that had a lot of gun salutes, I think, was Qatar. Oman. Oman was ranked alongside Jaipur, Jodhpur, etc. But the rest of them were considered small little kind of village states, Yeah.
And now look at them. Now look at the guns that they have, which we call petrol. Anyways, Sam, now let's talk about the part about Burma was absolutely brilliant. So what I've done, I want to understand the partition of Burma, but I also want people to go and read the book to know the complete details. I want you to give us information enough for people to get excited, and for them to know what happened. And then I want them to deep dive and go into the book.
Sure. So the key thing that I think, again, is surprising for many people here is that Burma was the largest and richest province of British India. Okay? So far larger and far richer than Bengal, Punjab, like Madras, Bombay, these other colonial provinces. What happens is that you have more people sailing to Rangoon for a better life than to New York. But Rangoon overtakes New York as the biggest import and emigration port in the world. And that's why we have songs like Mera Piya Gare Gai Rangoon, and all these lovely songs are all about people going off in search of a new life in Rangoon.
Even more than Calcutta you're talking about. I mean, so Calcutta was...
Calcutta was the political center, but Rangoon was the biggest emigration port in the world.
Economic, like what we have Bombay today.
Exactly. So it was hugely central. And we've only forgotten this because Burma's military would take it out of the world economy, kind of make it crumble, turn into a military dictatorship, right? We've forgotten how prominent it was in the 1920s and 30s. But what this does is people, indigenous Burmese people are increasingly pushed out of jobs. Most workers in Rangoon are Bengalis and Tamils. And Tagore arrives and feels like there's double colonialism here, is his phrase, because, there's the British ruling, but there's also Indians who are basically being racist to the local Burmese. And he compares it to how, many Indians are towards people from Northeast India today, where they say, they're savages and they're eating dogs and all this kind of racist rhetoric. That's not true. Burmese people have their own very proud history, right? So increasingly in the 1920s, there's talk about we want a separate colony from India. They're not asking for independence. They're asking for two separate colonies so that they can control Indian immigration. And it feels a bit like kind of Brexit or something. But the big thing that changes is the Great Depression. Okay, so this is when Gandhi Mahatma Gandhi arrives in Rangoon and says, you are not part of Bharatvarsha, so you should have a separate colony. Meanwhile, Mahatma Uttama, the other Burmese Mahatma, says, oh no, actually we are, Buddha was from India, thus we are all part of the same joint heritage. So initially it's this kind of quite political discussions about identity and who feels what. What changes is the Great Depression. There's a recession, just like 2008, the Wall Street crash, and suddenly all these farmers default on their debts. Suddenly no one can repay their loans. And the crucial bankers across Burma, the bankers were the Chettiars from Tamil Nadu. Okay? The Chettiars, the reason that when you go to Chettinad today and have that amazing, like the best chicken in India, frankly.
I agree.
Yeah, like Chettinad is just amazing food.
Amazing.
But the reason that all those mansions are made from Burmese teak is because they were the main bankers in Burma, right? So all of those mansions are built off this wealth. When this Wall Street crash happens, the Chettiars seize in 6 years, they seize an astonishing 1/3 of Burmese agricultural land. Suddenly 1/3 of Burma's land is owned by Chettiars. And suddenly the debates about separation go from kind of vague discussions of I feel Indian, oh, I feel Burmese, to we need to kick these guys out because they are stealing our land. And suddenly you get the beginning of an anti-Indian rhetoric. Okay? In April Fool's Day 1937, this will culminate in the first partition of India, with Burma being separated off. And this guy called U Saw, this sort of evil politician, who I write a lot more about in the book, he's going to take over. And he will set into motion a series of laws that basically encourages kicking Indians out of Burma. He's also the origin for many anti-Indian pogroms that will emerge in Burma. And he's also, interestingly, the first Burmese politician to say that the Rohingya, who speak a dialect of Bengali, should also be kicked out because they must be Indians too. He gets that wrong. They've never been to Bengal, but they speak a dialect closely related to Bengali. And he says, we need to kick all these guys out. That's the reason that today, when Burmese people want to say a racist slur against the Rohingya people, they will give the word Chetty. Chetty, as in Chettiar, is the slur that they use against the Rohingya, and that's the origin of that. And as you were saying about the Long March, this will all culminate when the Japanese swoop down into Southeast Asia after bombing Pearl Harbor and entering World War II. Okay. Now, I think the story that we all grew up with in India is the story of Subhash Chandra Bose and, this extraordinary story. He shows up very big time in the book, as I'm sure you've read. But we forget what happened before he arrived. When the British evacuate from Burma because the Japanese are invading, many Indians are so worried that they're about to get lynched mobbed that they flee. And 366,000 Indians decide to flee on foot. So it's the largest migration recorded before 1947. And this mass exodus features very little, I think, in the kind of national remembering. There's no memorial in India to the, 20,000, 30,000 Indians who died in the hills of the Patkai. I think there should be. I think the Indian government should put up a memorial to remembering the Indians who died in the Long March. But it's this forgotten story in a sense. But it's also the origin of so many bits of food that we still eat in India today. The reason that all these, uncles of a certain generation all know how to cook khao is because they were living in Burma. That's the origin also of the great Lucknow biscuit brand, Burma Biscuits, And there's so many things like this that only begin to make sense once we understand this first great partition.
So basically, I can see two things happening over here. Initially, the Burmese leadership were very inspired by Gandhi and his philosophy. And obviously, there was a common link between India and Burma. Not just that they were a part of the British Empire, but that of Buddhism. That, of course, Gautam Siddhartha was from Patliputra or Patna, or I don't know. There's still debates around that.
Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, that region.
Lumbini, Bodh Gaya. So they love that this is the origin of the great religion. Buddhism used to be called the great religion, right? But then what happened, as you're saying, because of the Tamilians and the Bengalis stealing the jobs and actually controlling a lot of things, the public sentiment started going against the Indians. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, so when the public sentiment started going against the Indians, that is when that leader saw an opportunity that this is the right time for me to actually create a narrative against the Indians and drive them completely off, right? Is that what happened?
Yes, and I think none of it makes sense without the Great Depression. Yeah. Because if you didn't have the Great Depression, you wouldn't have had the Tamilian bankers having to take all the land as collateral. So their policy was simple. Their policy was, we'll give you a loan. If you can't repay it, we'll take your land.
Absolutely.
And these loans were far better for Burmese farmers than British loans. These guys were the economy that undercut the entire expansion of the Burmese economy. But when the Great Depression happens, the entire thing comes down. And again, I think that we, can look today at how global politics has changed as a result of the 2008 financial crash. Yeah. And there's some similarities. The end of globalization, the return of nationalism across the world, so that, Trump is putting up walls. You've got Britain leaving the European Union. Suddenly there's this turn away from globalization that was very much prevalent until 2008. I think the same thing happens then.
Yeah, Great Depression. And it's very funny that in that time in Burma, there was anti-Indian sentiments that, get the hell out of our land and don't steal our jobs. Isn't that what's happening in Australia? Isn't that what's happening in the UK, in the US? I mean, why is this a pattern that keeps on repeating? Why is it that we go out and we steal everybody's jobs?
The history is a strange thing when you see kind of these. I think that's it's just to do with population. India is a quarter of the world's population, or a fifth of the world's population, or something. And I think that it's just on sheer statistical level, India is home to some of the greatest minds in the world, and it's not surprising that Indians have throughout history traded abroad and migrated abroad. I think that we forget how not new Indians traveling internationally is. That's why, the largest Hindu temples in the world are now in Cambodia, because Indians were always trading abroad,
So it's not just about the number. It's also about the capabilities. It's also about the intellect. It is also about that we know how to run things, right? Because I do not see the same level of anti-China sentiment, for example. I don't see that happening anyway.
I think there was a lot in, for example, like Malaysia and Indonesia in the 1950s and 60s. There was, and that's because they were where, there were a lot of Chinese people migrating and living in communities. I think that there's a tragic, but undoubtedly there is a racial element for sure.
I think a lot of people, Sam, don't know this. I recently got to know about this thing, and very interesting. A lot of Chinese used to also consider at the time when India was, I think, under the British rule or not, I'm forgetting that, they used to consider India as a land of better opportunities. They actually migrated to Kolkata. And you had a lot of settlement of Chinese because they migrated for a better life. Is this true? Did the Chinese used to consider India as
not millions, but yes, there are several important Chinatowns. And I think that, I don't know whether it's true, but one of the lovely stories that I heard was that, some of the first communities to come to India were the Hakka community, which is why Hakka noodles are so big in India. And also that a lot of the early ones were sugar traders. And, previously Indians had been eating jaggery and gur, but they hadn't been having chini, which came from Chin.
People don't know that chini is a word, so we used to call them chinis, like chini. So chini. Refined sugar was, as a concept, was not manufactured in India. It was jaggery, you're right.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Sam, okay, so what was then, I also want to now understand that the partition of Burma happened. Had the Great Depression not happened, let's say, if I chuck that out of the equation, I again want to understand the psychology of our leaders. Would Gandhi have agreed to integrate Burma as a part of India if there was no Great Depression? Let's get the economics out of the equation. I want to understand the psychology. I want to understand their aim and vision and mindset. Would he have agreed for Burma to be a part? And did we lose something in today's country by not having Burma as a part of India? I also want to understand that.
So I think that Burma and Arabia, the same thing applies here. Gandhi was very much saying that they are welcome to join the Indian Union, but they must do so by choice. And there must be basically a kind of vote or some sort of democracy. They shouldn't be forced in to an Indian Union, was more of his argument. He was like, if they feel emotionally tied to India, then sure. But it shouldn't be just because of the fact that they were annexed by the British shouldn't mean that they eventually fall under Indian rule as well. He very much saw that as the basis. And so the same thing, I think, he would have loved for Dubai, etc., to be part of India, but he didn't want Indians themselves to become colonists, was his worry. He saw India as this geographically bounded thing by Bharat, and that if Indians took over these other parts of the world, then, I think that there is an argument, and I've spoken to a lot of people from the Emirates about this. Had Dubai become part of India, sure, it would have been very wealthy. But you can also imagine a sort of awful situation where suddenly, there were military crackdowns on the local Arab population so that the wealth could be extracted. And I think Gandhi was very certain that he didn't want, Indian nationalists to become what the British had become, is basically his argument. And he didn't want people to extract resources from another people.
But do you think, what's your analysis, that had all these places were not severed from the Indian Empire, would our leaders have been able to govern them properly? I mean, that's another question that comes up.
There are all sorts of questions, and I don't think that, unfortunately, we can really know. I do think, though, that there is something that's been lost. In terms of being able to freely travel, in terms of the cultural fusions that emerged. At the same time, I don't think that, you could say that the world would be better if it was all governed by one empire. I don't think that's true, Freedom of movement is wonderful, and we should all have the right to have complex identities of mixed heritage, and, the categories we use should be able to take into account our own complex identities. But I also think that there's a danger of romanticizing this kind of borderless world of empire in some sense. Just saying that you could have got rid of the British and then someone in Delhi inherits the whole empire doesn't make empire any better. I think one of the best things that we've done is left behind the age of empire and embraced this world of nationalism. And of course, nationalism has its own dangers, and you can just as much be a kind of rabid nationalist in any country in the world as much as you can be a rabid imperialist. But I do think it's better than imperialism and the subjugation of other people.
That's a great way to see it. Absolutely. That's a very great way to see it. I think we lost something that was very bad for a lot of people. Let's be very happy about that, rather than going into ifs and buts. I think that's a great win. Brilliantly said, Sam.
And yet I think that, there are so many lives that each of these partitions divided and screwed up, and the many families in Aden, for example, who had these complex Arab Gujarati identities suddenly had to pick one. They had to decide, I am Arab or I'm Gujarati, rather than being able to be fluid. And there's definitely a hardening of identity that results from all of this. Likewise, beforehand it was much easier to exist in Punjab as a Hindu who went to the Dargah on the weekend, when after partition there's a hard cleavage between Hindu practices and Muslim practices that there had never been before.
Correct. Sam, now I want to also discuss on a very important topic about India's role into the Second World War. I got to know a lot of stats from your book, but before that, I'm going to say something. I remember when Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk released. I think it was 4 or 5 years back. And I saw that movie in the hall because we are all fans of Christopher Nolan after Inception. I think after Inception, his Dunkirk.
Yeah, I love Inception.
Inception was crazy. So, but when I was in the hall, I was watching Dunkirk, I fell through the movie. And after I fall asleep actually. And when I was talking to my friends, like, Raghav, what happened? You didn't enjoy the movie? I'm like, no. The reason why I did not enjoy Dunkirk is I could not relate anything with that movie. No aspect of that movie was relatable to me as an Indian. I couldn't relate the sentiments when they were handling them certain beverages and foods in the train. A lot of scenes, I couldn't understand anything. I couldn't resonate with their laws. I couldn't resonate with anything, right? And I remember watching Border, JP Datta's Border, when I was a very young kid. And I rewatched that movie after I saw Dunkirk, because I was thinking, yeah, do we have a great war movie? I had also seen Brad Pitt's Fury. Brilliant movie, right? And you have Dunkirk, which I couldn't relate to. I rewatched Border and I realized, man, this is just a bloody musical. This is not a great war movie. It's a goddamn musical, right? Because we were young, we were kids. We had no idea. We were like, wow, look at Sunil Shetty. He's taking the mines and he's going and he's like, I'll kill you all. Nothing else. It's a musical and again, romanticizing. It's romanticizing. There was no bone of practicality in that movie, right? Now, there's a line from the book. I'm going to say from the book. By the end of the conflict, India had deployed the largest volunteer army in the history. 2.5 million men, out of whom 90,000 would be killed or maimed. In the words of historian Yasmin Khan, Britain did not fight the Second World War. The British Empire did. Sam, I want you to tell us about India's contribution, its sacrifice, its loss, how it impacted the nation, everything when it comes to the Second World War. It's just something that nobody knows anything about. There's no pop culture representation of Second World War, which has come out of our nation at all.
I think the reason that there isn't is because of there is a muddle, basically, about the fact that, because we now venerate the INA and Subhas Chandra Bose and fighting against Britain, basically talking about the hundreds of thousands of Indians who died fighting for Britain, often just so that they could make some money because they were so poor in their villages, gets left out. And yet there's a Yasmin Khan book, The Raj at War, as well as Raghu Karnad's book, Furthest Field, are the two of the best books that you can read, and I thoroughly recommend them both. We forget that, so firstly, Indians were posted across the Western Front as well, particularly in El Alamein, which is now in Egypt. They were posted a lot in the kind of, the fronts in the Middle East. But probably the most important contribution to India was the battles of Imphal and Kohima in what's now Manipur and Nagaland. We forget that the British Empire and the Japanese Empire, two of the largest empires that the world had ever known, clashed in Nagaland in 1944. And the stories that come out of this clash are astonishing. And I think we know Subhas Chandra Bose's role, but we very rarely think about how freaking crazy it is that the two largest empires of the 20th century clashed in Nagaland. And that is just the moment that you just begin to comprehend that. And it wasn't just, the Japanese and the INA versus the British and the Indians. You had Chinese soldiers, you had West African soldiers, you had people from every British colony in the world and all the British European allies fighting the Japanese alongside, Germans and all of the Axis powers. And so the world descended upon Nagaland and Manipur in a way that I think that we have completely forgotten. It was one of the most important turning points in World War II as well. The Japanese Empire had been expanding since basically they had annexed first Korea, and then, bits of China and all sorts of atrocities. Britain is no one to speak. Britain was also doing all sorts of atrocities, but the Japanese were kind of, they really were putting humans in human experiments. So the reason we know the boiling point of a human, for example, is thanks to their wartime experiments on Koreans, and so it wasn't necessarily a kind of, it was one of the great turning points was after the Japanese had swept through the whole of Southeast Asia. They'd taken Indonesia. They'd taken China, or half of China. They'd taken much of Thailand and French Indochina, which later became Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Suddenly they're taking Burma as well, and they are stopped in Kohima. What the hell? And then the British Empire moves out again, and the Allied troops turn the tide of battle, which ultimately culminates in, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the end of World War II. But I think that the scale of the militarization of India is hugely important. It's impossible to understand the Bengal famine without understanding this. It's impossible to understand why so many weapons were in Punjab in 1947 without understanding this. And I think the stories that have come out of World War II in India are incredible and deserve to be known. I particularly love this story about the fact that all of the India before World War II didn't have any sniper scopes, like for guns, right? And so they get involved, all the Jaipur gem carvers who are going to start carving crystals into sniper scopes for the Indian Army. And you get the origins of the Indian Army today are founded in World War II, because the Indian Army goes from a rather small entity into one of the largest military entities that the world has ever known. It would later be partitioned between India and Pakistan, of course, but it's so important for world history.
So I think, what did we gain from our participation in the World War was the current Indian Army ecosystem and the structure that we see. Is that what you're saying? So that's a product of India. So before that, you're saying, or does it mean that the Indians were not involved in warfare in a structured mannerism? That is only after the post-World War involvement that they got that.
They very much are also participants in World War I, in earlier wars, as basically kind of British foot soldiers, but it's in World War II that it goes from, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000, to the largest volunteer army that the world has ever seen. It's as a result of this that it turns into most of the great soldiers in Indian history, including Sam Manekshaw, Jacob, or General Nagra. So many of these figures entered the army during World War II.
And I think this is yeah, sorry, please.
And what I found particularly astonishing, after the Battle of Kohima, I think there are two soldiers who are given, an extra rank and kind of not knighted. I can't remember what the phrase is, but basically kind of given a raise and put up a position. The two soldiers, I think, were General Niazi, who would later surrender East Pakistan, and Sam Manekshaw, who would later fight against him in 1971. So they were the two great prestigious soldiers of that battle.
Like the Paramveer Chakra, they were elevated up to that level.
Exactly.
So Sam was, so there is a connection between the Bengal famines and the World War II, right? Or the World War I, World War II and the Bengal famines. So because India's resource, and at that time when we're talking about these things, Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of UK, of England, right? And Winston Churchill was the one who actually declared the war on Germany. He was advised against it because he was like, if you do try to declare the war on Germany, they're just going to bomb your entire nation. And he took that risk, right? Could you explain the connection between Winston Churchill's decision of involving India and its resources in the World War II and the Bengal famine, and why the world and the Indians need to remember the Bengal famine, and what are the learnings that we can draw from that?
So the Bengal famine emerges. I think there's a lot of narratives that basically talk about how Churchill created the famine. He didn't. The reason that the famine happens is because Bengal has been reliant on Burmese rice. And when the Japanese conquer Burma, there's suddenly a line drawn there and no rice can get across the front line. But he very much makes it worse, Churchill, by not allowing extra supplies to be sent out. And there were all sorts of rice in, kept in silos, etc., that wasn't allowed to be released into the public. But I think it had an extraordinary effect this famine that changed the shape of India. And also, I think we forget, was also a crucial reason for the creation of Bangladesh, because mostly the working class in the region were Muslims. And the landowners who owned all the rice tended to be Hindu. And one of the Pakistan idea that Jinnah has first articulated in 1940 had not been that popular in Bengal until the Bengal famine. And in particular, I think Savarkar leads a movement to try and persuade Hindu landowners to boycott giving it to Muslims as a result of basically to boycott the Muslim League, you know? But as a result, you get millions of Muslim farmers who actually sign up to the Muslim League. They say, these Hindu landowners are refusing to give us rice. And it's impossible to understand the sudden popularity of the Muslim League in Bengal without understanding the Bengal famine as well.
So Sam, now another thing I have taken from a book is Subhash Chandra Bose remains one of the most polarizing figures in the Indian history, revered as a secular liberator by some and reviled as a Nazi collaborator by others. I want you to please explain, where should we as Indians fit Subhash Chandra Bose? Why was he even thought of as somebody who was a traitor? His relationships with Hitler, his collaboration with the Japanese for the INA, whatever you feel that Indians should know about his ecosystem and his contribution, I think it's very crucial. I think he had a very big role to play in the ultimate, British leaving from the Indian ecosystem. So let's talk about him.
Yeah, so I think the INA war trials are one of the reasons that Britain leaves when it does, because when they're trying to hang all the INA soldiers and put them on trial in the Red Fort, it unifies the nation against them. Actually, we forget that many Indians didn't know about the INA during Subhash Chandra Bose's lifetime because of the fact that Britain had such severe censorship. So many of them found out during the INA war trials what Subhash Chandra Bose had done, and it's then that he became the figure that we now revere. I think that he is one of the most fascinating figures, and there are so many biographies of him and writings of him, and I think that he, in one figure, encapsulates the complexity of World War II for India and why India struggles to commemorate World War II today, why it is that we don't really kind of hear about it that much, why we don't hear the fact that India saw the largest volunteer army in the world. Because for most Indians, World War II was a noble endeavor in terms of defeating the Nazis. But at the same time, for Indians, it was a battle between, do we pick fascism or imperialism? Do we side with the British or with the Nazis, right? And so it wasn't as straightforward as I think many people in the West like to imagine. In the West, it's seen as fascism versus kind of good old-fashioned kind of European values, right? Which is very simplistic. I think most Indian leaders like Nehru, Jinnah, etc., understood this complexity, but Bose goes a step further. He stages this extraordinary escape from kind of house arrest in Kolkata, flees into Afghanistan, crosses into the Soviet Union, flies into Berlin, where he basically sides with the Nazis and tries to see if he can get Hitler's help in kicking Britain out of India. Okay, he initially lives a rather lovely life. Many Indian prisoners of war he helps reorganize into a segment of the Waffen-SS. There's a kind of Punjabi section of the Waffen-SS in Nazi Germany that, is going around, hunting down traitors to the Nazi regime, and indeed possibly some hunting down Jews and that kind of thing. Very complex legacy. But Bose initially basically thinks that Hitler will come round to side and help liberate India. But he eventually decides that Hitler's completely mad, not to be trusted. And again, people who dismiss Bose as a Nazi collaborator don't realize the fact that he does completely dismiss Hitler in the end. Once he's spent enough time around him, and once he's finally met him in person, which takes months, he finally basically realizes this guy's a complete psycho. So he then takes a submarine to Japan, and here he finds much more of people speaking his language. These are Asians fighting Europeans, and are speaking in the same language as him. And it's here that he manages to take over the emerging INA and create an army that he can help use to liberate India from the British. And what I think we forget again about the INA, many of the Indians who joined the INA had never seen India before. There was already, we were mentioning earlier, the Indian diaspora, and businesses and people working everywhere. Most of the soldiers who joined Bose were either captured prisoners of war from the Indian army who had come to India, but many of them were Indians who'd lived in Saigon or Jakarta or Bangkok for generations and decide to join him out of a sense of nationalism and out of a sense of trying to kick out the British. So he finally manages to lead the army into this battle of Imphal and Kohima. He helps establish Azad Hind, which only really rules as a puppet state in the Andaman Islands, really. And although initially very hopeful, I think Bose, as well as Aung San, who is his kind of Burmese counterpart, who's running the kind of Free Burma government, both of them begin to become disillusioned that the Japanese are kind of saying that they're independent, but they don't quite have as much autonomy as they would like. And for the Burmese, increasingly, they're like, this is just another form of colonialism. And the Japanese are just replacing the Brits. But Bose is this, and then he ultimately, of course, after the war dies in this plane crash, or so we think. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories that say he never died. I think that he's one of the most fascinating figures and one who adds a whole layer of complexity to World War II that we don't usually hear. But I also don't think that we should be under any kind of idea that he didn't have to make compromises. And I think Bose himself was horrified once he realized what Hitler represented by what he'd done, if that makes sense. And I think a lot of the recent work on Bose, there's been a lot of very good books come out recently on Bose in Nazi Germany, and his whole gradual transition from very hopeful, becoming a Nazi collaborator, to someone who began to be horrified by what he saw there. And he eventually concludes that Hitler's a complete madman.
That's why did he side with the Japanese then to take their help? Okay, that part didn't work because that man's a psycho. Would you help me in liberating the Britain?
Yeah, and the Japanese crucially were German allies at the time. And so he took a German submarine to get to Japan. But once in Japan, he found people who are much more like-minded. Although he didn't agree with everything with Imperial Japan, he found them a lot more on the same page than anyone in Nazi Germany, basically.
But I think Japan also had intentions of invading India eventually.
Yeah.
That's what they wanted, right? So I think Subhash Chandra Bose could have helped them indirectly or unconsciously if that would have culminated in the complete annihilation of the British by the Japanese. We would have had a new ruler. The Japanese would be ruling over the Indian subcontinent, if not the British, right? So I think you're right. There's a lot of pros and cons. It's not that easy as it seems. But kudos to that man for first collaborating with Hitler.
He's extraordinary. He's
Okay, now Sam, we are coming to the meat of the curry. Okay, I really want to now talk about the partition of India and Pakistan. But Sam, before that, I want to just understand a little bit. So I came to know two things, one about Jinnah and one about Gandhi after reading a book. I'll start with the Gandhi part first because you have to help me get a good night's sleep today, Sam, because I was not able to sleep properly. This is not done, yeah. I mean, what the hell? I mean, this is a what the hell moment. And I want to know what kind of leaders are we following. And I could be wrong because this was mind-boggling. So this is from the book, which obviously is based on a fact, which is available everywhere. We don't know. Over the coming years, Gandhi, began his controversial brahmacharya experiments. sleeping next to, oh my God, I can't even say it, sleeping next to naked women, including his 16-year-old grandniece Abha, to test the woe of his celibacy. We are calling him the father of the nation. Sometimes when I read, I'm like, there is something wrong with him. Maybe Subhash Chandra Bose also found out he's also not right. Sam, help me dissect this part of his. I mean, what the hell? This is a what the hell moment. What is this? What does that tell about that man? I want to understand.
He is one of the most intriguing, muddling figures to research. He's both has these moments of utter genius and moments of like this, where you're kind of just rather disgusted. And I think that this shows up repeatedly throughout his career. I have no doubt that he was one of the most important figures in India's march to independence. And without Gandhi, would India look like it does today? Possibly not. You know, he is so crucial. At the same time, there is so much like this that is deeply unsavory and I think gets brushed over. What I like to think is that by focusing on the entire picture of these figures, I think we far too often, I mentioned to you before the podcast, that we far too often lionize these crazy figures as if they're not human beings. And I think that, you know, Gandhi, Jinnah, Winston Churchill in Britain have each been lionized into these father of the nation figures, brushing over all sorts of unsavory details about them. So most Brits would never know about Churchill's very racist comments about India. You know, the fact that kind of, you know, during the Bengal famine, Churchill is asked, you know, we should send them some rice. And he says, if the Indians are starving, why isn't Gandhi dead yet? You know, that kind of stuff. Likewise, Pakistan creates this image of Jinnah as this kind of Islamic founder of the nation that brushes over the fact that for the longest time, he was the primary ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity and wasn't a particularly practicing Muslim. He drank whiskey. He possibly even ate pork. He had a Parsi wife, you know? And for Gandhi, these brahmacharya experiments for me are, you know, you can't not include them. These are very real stories that today, you know, one has to address. These are unsavory facts. But we shouldn't, I think history is about these shades of grey. The fact that all of these figures are complex and nuanced and, you know, that many of the people that we revere have hugely unsavory aspects, like Bose having to collaborate with Hitler and possibly being, you know, a participant in the hunting down of Jews. I mean, not knowingly, but he was, you know, working with the government that was doing the Holocaust. He later rejects that, but you know, it's certainly a stain on his reputation. I think that these horrible experiments done by Gandhi are much the same thing, and we need to grapple with it if we're to truly understand him. So.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. So one thing that you said about Jinnah, which leads me to the main question, is that there was a time wherein Jinnah never wanted India and Pakistan to be separated. Now, we know the brutal partition that happened. We know the mass murders and the riots that took place, Sam. If you were to summarize the India versus Pakistan ecosystem, the division, in 5 minutes or 7 minutes, how would you explain what went wrong? Was what happened inevitable? And I also want to understand if India would have accepted the Cripps proposal, would we have averted the partition of India and Pakistan? Because this always used to linger in my mind. Was the Cripps proposal a blessing in disguise that we completely overlooked? So I want you to explain the entire India-Pakistan debacle and the ecosystem.
So the key thing to remember is that Jinnah, for the first half of his career, is not fighting for an independent nation called Pakistan. You know, he is regarded by Sarojini Naidu, the most important woman in the freedom movement, as the primary ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. Okay, and he is married to a Parsi woman. He's famously going to all these jazz parties in Bombay. He's not the figure who is now revered in Pakistan, this kind of demure figure in an achkan and one of those kind of caracal hats. He is your kind of Bombay politician driving, or Bombay lawyer driving around in a swanky car. He begins to change once basically over the course of the 1930s, Hindu nationalism's on the rise, and he increasingly basically feels that Muslims need protections to stop them basically being screwed over, despite the fact that they were a third of the Indian population at the time. They only constituted about, under half of the population in most districts. They were spread across the country rather than grouped in certain areas. And so he was worried that Muslim politicians were always losing elections, right? Because they'd always get 30% of the vote and then nothing more. And he was worried that despite, they were massively underrepresented and they needed constitutional safeguards. They needed a third of all seats to guarantee that they would kind of, have the say in parliament that they needed. After all, there were more Muslims in India at the time than there were in the entire Arab world. India was more sacred for many Muslims in terms of local Sufi shrines, etc., than, many of the places in the Arab world. And, the greatest place of Muslim learning in the world in the 1920s was Hyderabad. These are all things that have disappeared today. Now, what happens is that gradually there's also a huge amount that it's a personal fallout with Jinnah and Gandhi, between Jinnah and Gandhi and Nehru. Jinnah is booed off stage one time for not addressing Gandhi as Mahatma. He doesn't think that he should be revered as a great soul. He's a politician like any other. And so there's a lot of personal animosity that comes in. Anyway, in 1940, Jinnah proposes the idea of Pakistan at the Lahore Resolution in Lahore Fort, just outside in Minto Park, what's now where the Minar-e-Pakistan is in Lahore today. What I think many Indians and Pakistanis forget today is the fact that he wasn't necessarily seeking an independent nation state. He was seeking a separate nation within the same nation state. So what that means is Britain is recognized as England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all being separate nations within the boundaries of a single state, with a single army, etc. And that seems to be what he was actually seeking. And you can see this by the fact that many Muslim leaguers actually resign once it's clear that Pakistan is going to become a separate nation state. You have people like Hasrat Mohani, who is the politician from UP, who coins the term Inqilab Zindabad. He's a communist, right? He is a Muslim who's devoted to Krishna and regards Krishna as a Sufi saint. There's a whole fascinating story there. Wild figure, needs to be talked about much more. But he argues that basically there were prophets sent down to every land, and that the prophet of Braj was Krishna, and Krishna should be revered as a Sufi saint. So he spends all of his time not moving to Pakistan, but moving to Braj. And that was actually this idea that Pakistan might not be a separate nation state is one that remains as late as August 1946, 1 year before partition. And for me, this is the closing doors point. This is the moment that it becomes inevitable, because the British bring out the cabinet mission, okay? And the cabinet mission says, okay, you want Pakistan, you want India, here's our offer, okay? We want to get out of India as quickly as possible. We will create a federal system like the UK or like the United States with different states, okay? And each one has the same number of people in their parliament. We have East Pakistan, West Pakistan, North India, South India, and Deccan. And Jinnah accepts. Jinnah says yes. Nehru and Gandhi later pull out on the basis of all sorts of reasons that I don't think we have time to get into now, chiefly to do with things like the status of Peshawar, which I think are kind of rather brushed over. I think that there is so much that these figures, particularly Nehru and Gandhi, do that's extraordinary and has created the country we know today. And I think that, currently, I think they're being kind of demonized in the press, etc., in a way that's kind of rather unjust. At the same time, I do think that this was one of the biggest mistakes. The failure of the cabinet mission plan was potentially a opportunity for some sort of united India to emerge, and it's turned down. It would have, of course, led to a very different India from today, an India where a third of the population was Muslim. But I think that, millions of deaths could have potentially been averted. But of course, the deaths were not foreseen at this point, and I think no one had any conception at the time how bad the communal violence that would erupt would happen. Again, I think that we overlook the fact that Punjab was awash with guns from World War II, and no one could imagine what actually happened, which was that many of these guys were soldiers who just started gunning down people of the other religion, and kind of a sort of mutual genocide would emerge across the country with, ethnic cleansing, with Muslims killing Hindus and Hindus killing Muslims, and all sorts of atrocities that would emerge in the aftermath of Direct Action Day. Direct Action Day was only announced by Jinnah as a result of the failure of the cabinet mission plan. So I think that for me and anyone who really studies this period, it's the closing doors moment. It's the moment that I think each of the partitions I talk about in my book has one of these closing doors moments. For Burma, it's 1931 and the Wall Street crash. For Bangladesh's independence, it's Operation Searchlight and Pakistan's military crackdown in 1971 March. I think as late as January 1971, Bangladesh wasn't necessarily inevitable. And I think that as late as August 1946, Pakistan wasn't necessarily inevitable as it exists today. I think that some sort of Pakistan as a federal state would have been much more likely.
So by closing gate, you mean now you cannot go back. There's no turning back. Now it is inevitable. This is something which is going to happen.
By the time that Mountbatten comes out in March 1947, there is so much communal violence, there is so much slaughter, that he sees partition as basically the only way out.
For them as well. For them as well, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And but I think, Mountbatten is also not a figure that we've discussed enough in this podcast, because I think he makes the crucial error that also consigns millions to their fate by rushing it. He announces that he's given by Clement Attlee in London, the Prime Minister, who succeeded Churchill. He's given 1.5 years to figure out some sort of, future for either a united India or an India and Pakistan. He decides to rush it. Yeah. He decides to rush it and is given 77 days. He announces that partition will happen in June and independence comes by August. In actual fact, he would have been able to last until the end of 1948 if he followed Clement Attlee's.
And I think when I was reading about the part, he was very reluctant on coming to India as well. He's like, he never wanted to. And when he did come to India, he realized that he is now the single decision maker ruling over 1/3 of the entire world's population. And I think what who said about him that he's just a toy for Nehru to play with. Can you explain what does that mean?
Patel,
that he's just a toy.
That line comes from Sardar Patel, who is the kind of, the Congress fixer. He's the kind of brute force behind Nehru's kind of clean facade. And he basically saw Mountbatten as this kind of slight idiot who was malleable. I think we forget also Patel's role in all this. Patel, I think one of the more sinister things to emerge in recent years has been the fact that Patel had complete control of the intelligence services throughout and didn't give the intelligence to either Mountbatten or Nehru. So a lot of these guys were doing stuff without full access to intelligence.
I had no idea. That is interesting.
Patel was a kind of puppet master for all sorts. And I think a lot of new research is now coming out about basically showing Patel had a lot more power than we previously thought.
That's incredible. So he's just not the man who united the princely states. There are more layers to him. And I think that was the reason why he was pitted as becoming the prime minister, which did not happen actually. I think he voluntarily gave way to Nehru as well in a way ki, yeah, it's absolutely fine. If Gandhi wants Nehru to be the prime minister, let it be. I think their blind-sidedness with Gandhi was also something that sometimes do shock me. कि बापू ने बोल दिया तो बोल दिया, as in Bapu says it's absolutely fine. That again, what we're talking about, Sam, right? That we are trying to romanticize, we are trying to deify the leaders, that even these most intelligent leaders in the ecosystem were not even opposing, you know. Okay, Sam, one last thing I just want to just understand very quickly, because I think we have 5 minutes of time. You have 7 minutes of time. Again, I'm going to quote something. Britain was the largest imperial power on the planet, whose institutional racism was woven into the fabric of life in the Raj. Hitler himself had used the British autobiography to teach the SS how a tiny elite could subjugate an inferior race. I am circling back to my opening remarks of me feeling like an inferior race. I want you to quickly tell me, how was Britain able to subjugate, and are we truly as Indians an inferior race?
Well, I mean, the answer to that is quite obviously no. India is home to some of the greatest civilizations known to mankind, the greatest array of archaeological sites, some of the greatest philosophical thought, and absolutely it's not an inferior race. That is complete colonial pseudoscience invented in the 19th century to justify Britain's colonial expansion. It's complete nonsense. How was Britain able to do it? It's a very complex